Hello class, this is to help you get started with your first paper. Now this is specific to your Sir Gawain and the Green Knight paper that you're going to start working on this week, but you can use this for any paper you write for me, and actually for most literature papers you will write in the future, because the advice sort of applies across the board. But before we get started on talking about what makes a good thesis statement, let's back up a little bit and think about why you're writing an essay in the first place. And here's what you do in an essay. The first part of this is through close study of the work. So an essay is not a place for you to just talk about your feelings or opinions about what happened. It needs to be based on a very close reading and a close study of the actual words that are in there, which is why quotation is going to be so important when we talk about developing the content of your paper later. And this is always where you need to start. Sometimes people like to start by developing opinions and then going to hunt in the work for stuff to support it. It works much better if you do that the other way around. If you look at what's there and then you develop an opinion or an idea or an argument based on that. So through that close study you do one of two things, or sometimes both. You learn something new from the work, and then your writing is presenting that thing you learned to other people. Something you might not have seen without that close study. Or you can substantiate an opinion. So you answer a question that people might legitimately disagree on and say, here's what I think, and here's why. And you're going to give evidence for that opinion from the work. And this description of what a paper about a work of literature is holds true from now pretty much until you get your PhD in literature. This is what all papers about literature are supposed to do. And it just gets more complicated and longer the better you get at it and the longer you study. And the next step, once you have done one of these two things or both of them, is that it needs to be expressed clearly and coherently. So this is the writing piece of working on an essay. The first part is sort of the understanding and content piece. The second part is the writing piece, which means can you communicate what you've learned to someone else in a clear and coherent way so that they can understand and either be persuaded by you or not be persuaded by you, but not because you've done a messy, jumbled up job of presenting your ideas. So these are the two main goals we'll be working on as we work on your essays, and these are the two main areas you'll be graded on. I'm going to be looking at your content and whether you're expressing something new about the work or something we can learn about the work that you might not otherwise have missed, whether it's based on that close reading, and how well you've expressed yourself. So, now to get to the core question here, what is a thesis statement exactly? Well, for the purposes of this class and probably literature papers in general, a thesis statement does three things. First, it answers a substantial question. There has to be something somebody wants to know about the paper. Now, in the case of this class, and probably in most classes for the next several years, that question is going to be given to you by the teacher in the form of an essay prompt. As you get older and older and better at this, they will take that away and you will have to come up with a question on your own. But that's far in the future. So first it has to answer a question. If it's something nobody cares about, then you probably shouldn't be writing a thesis statement about it. Second is it makes an arguable claim. This means that you're stating something that could possibly be disagreed with or is potentially news to someone who has already read the work. This means statements of fact about what happened or what it's about are not a thesis statement. Summaries are not a thesis statement because it's making no claim. Somebody who's read this knows it already. There has to be some possibility or some room for disagreement in order for it to be a thesis statement. And finally, it needs to include your main ideas. So it's got to have sort of like a little roadmap to your essay in it. So people know what to expect and they start looking for it. This is part of that, second half of paper writing about expressing your ideas clearly. If people know what to look for, they have an easier job of finding it. So it's part of pointing your readers and giving them a little shove in the direction you want them to go. And we'll talk about what this looks like and what it doesn't look like a little bit later. So, now that we know what a thesis statement is, how do you get there? First, you start with the question. Like I said, it has to answer a substantial question. And in this case, it's given to you. Here's your essay prompt for your Sir Gawain and the Green Knight essay. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has many paired or parallel characters, settings, or situations. Compare and contrast the pair that interests you most. How do the differences and similarities in this pair develop the themes of the poem? Now look at this carefully. So there's sort of an introductory sentence that makes a statement about the work, and then it tells you to do something. Compare and contrast the pair that interests you most. So you're going to need to choose one of these paired or parallel things that I mentioned in the first sentence, and it's going to be comparing and contrasting. You probably know how to do that by now. But it's followed up with another question. So just comparing and contrasting isn't going to be sufficient to answer this question. How do the differences and similarities in this pair develop the themes of the poem? So you're not just going to be able to say, look, here's a difference, here's a similarity, the end. What is it for? What does it help us learn? What ideas does it point us towards? What themes does it help us better understand? That's the question. That's your job. This is what your thesis statement needs to answer. So once you've figured out exactly what the question is asking of you, you start, like I said before, by that close and careful study of the text. So you don't try and answer it without looking in your book somewhere. You start by finding the relevant passages. So just for the sake of demonstration, I've decided that the pair that interests me most is the old woman and the young woman in Bertilac's castle. So I went hunting through my book, and I found the passages that are relevant to those two. The first one is the one where they're introduced, and the author directly compares and contrasts them for you, which is helpful. There are a couple of other places where Sir Gawain is sort of sitting in between them at dinner. So he's got one on one side and one on the other side. The third one is passages related to just the younger woman and her beauty and attractiveness. So that's probably not something that's going to be central to my argument, but it's helpful to have those as other examples. And the last one is when we get sort of the big bombshell about who the elder woman is. In fact, she's really the great witch Morgan Le Fay, and Sir Gawain's own aunt. So these are the passages I'm going to be relying on most heavily as I develop my ideas. So I found where the author talks about them. Now what do I do? I need to make some kind of preliminary claim. What do I think is this going to be about? I think I have to think about it a little bit more before I'm ready. So let's actually go on to the next slide where we're going to see what we do. First, you need to organize the information that you've collected. So you find all these passages, and in the case of similarities and differences, comparison and contrast, it's really easy just to put them in a chart. You can put them in a bunch of different charts. This one is sorted into similarities and differences. You can also put the young lady in one column and the old lady in the other column. You can even make one of those fancy Venn diagrams if that works better for you. But you should organize your information in some way. You should take some kind of notes to help you figure out what you've got. And in those passages, as I read through them, I noticed that their differences, which are more obvious at the beginning, are in appearance. That's what the author emphasizes when they first show up. He gives great detail. He sort of goes feature by feature and describes, say, the face of the young woman and then the face of the old woman, and then the clothes of the young woman and the clothes of the old woman. So they have clear differences in appearance and attractiveness. And at the end, we realize that they have differences in how they display sort of their power or influence. The young woman has a very obvious power in her ability to tempt Gawain. She is very attractive, and she uses that to try and get him to do what she wants. The old woman doesn't seem to have that kind of power at all, but in fact she does. It's just secret. Nobody knows about it. She is pulling the strings sort of behind the scenes in a way that the younger woman is not. So those are the two main differences I saw in these two women. The similarities is that Gawain is sort of links them. He sits between them. There's one on either side. They're both women, obviously. I didn't write that down, but that is in fact a similarity, which is partly what makes them parallel characters to begin with. If they're just two totally different people, then they're not parallels. And so the fact that Gawain is sitting between them sort of links them up, and the fact that they're both women of this household links them up. And they're also similar in that they're testing Gawain. It's part of their job to figure out if Gawain is as good as his reputation says he is. And the younger woman sort of does the practical work of testing him, while the older one is sort of the mastermind who came up with the whole plan, which included the encounter with the Green Knight and the whole beheading game to begin with. So they both have this role in testing Sir Gawain. Okay. Once you've organized your information, it's time to draft your thesis statement. So I sort of got ahead of myself on the last slide. So you don't do it there, you do it here. Okay, I have this information, I've got these similarities and differences. Now is the time for me to move from there to an actual thesis statement. And here's what I've got. Okay, I started off with the differences. Although the ladies of the castle are initially presented as opposites to highlight the power of physical attraction. Okay, notice this part of the thesis statement does two things, right? It indicates the contrast that I'm going to be talking about. So it's saying, look, I did do the contrast part. And it says what it's for. What does this emphasis on differences do for us? It shows us the power of physical attraction, because the younger woman, who is so pretty, is able to attract Gawain, while the older one doesn't at all. Okay? So it has that, how does it help us, what does it teach us, piece to it. Second part, the similarity between these two demonstrates the power of women to reveal true character. So we're moving on from differences to similarities, and it focuses on looking at those similarities and the fact that the author has established those similarities means. Okay? And their similarity here is that they're both testing Gawain to see how good he really is. And he passes the temptations test by not falling into sexual sin, but he does not quite, he mostly, but not quite, passes the test of courage that the Green Knight poses to him. So it makes us rethink, looking at these parallel women, these two characters who have this role that's sort of hidden until the very end, until we finally understand what their real purposes are. You might think that women are just the bad, evil, temptress people in this story. And in fact, that's what Gawain first thinks when he finds out the whole setup, and that he's in essence been betrayed into keeping that green girdle of hers. He goes through all of the evil temptress women in the Bible and says they're just like them and they're all terrible and it's all their fault. But the Green Knight modifies that, and it becomes clear that it's not all their fault. They were just testing Gawain. It was up to him to pass the test, which he didn't quite do, and he's angry with himself and sort of passing it off on them. So by looking at these two together, we can see that the role of women is not just to lead people into sin, it's to reveal their character, to reveal their own flaws to themselves, because Gawain knows himself better at the end of this. So this is a good draft thesis statement. Now, it's not perfect. It will probably change over the course of writing the paper. It might even need to be broken into 2 sentences. There can be 2-sentence thesis statements. That's acceptable. It's important to be as concise as you can, but especially when you're talking about comparing and contrasting, sometimes you just need separate sentences to do that. But it's a good place to start. It gives me some guidance. It lets me know what the main ideas are. I'm going to be talking first about their contrasts, their opposites, and how they show the difference in their physical attractiveness. And then I'm going to be talking about their similarities and emphasizing how those reveal character. So this is where we should end up. However, there are other places to end up. Let's look at some examples of bad thesis statements. So here's the question, just to remind you. Remember, the first requirement of a thesis statement is that it actually answers the question. This thesis statement doesn't do that. The similarities and differences between these two women develop the themes of the poem. This just puts in sentence form the question that I asked you. And it seems obvious that this is not a good thesis statement because it tells you nothing whatever, but I actually get this a lot. And I think that's not because people don't know that it doesn't say anything, but because they haven't done their thinking first. Without looking at the text and organizing your information, like I said, you don't actually know how they develop the themes of the poem. So you just say that, well, I'm sure they probably do. So you just write this down and go with it. I want you to do the work first so you actually know the answer to the question and don't have to restate it. Remember, the second one is that it has to make an arguable claim. Here's an example of one that does not do that. Although Gawain greatly prefers the attractive lady, the other one turns out to be just as important. This is merely a statement of fact about the plot of this particular poem. It doesn't tell me, who has already read it, anything I don't already know. Your audience for this is somebody who is already familiar with the basic outlines of the poem. So nobody could disagree with this. This is just something that's true. And it's sort of on its way towards an idea that Gawain seems to prefer the attractive lady, but the other one is also important. But it hasn't gotten from there to an actual claim that someone might possibly disagree with. Okay, and finally, it doesn't include your main ideas. This is the last part. Okay. Through these contrasts, the more powerful role of women in the poem is better understood. Now, this is probably the best of these bad thesis statements because it makes something that's pretty close to a claim, but it's missing what the other one has, which is a level of detail about how and in what order you're going to talk about things. There's going to be some contrasting, and there's going to be some understanding of the role of women, and maybe about how powerful they can be. But it's too vague. It's too general. It needs to be more precise in order to give your reader the sort of mental roadmap they need to make it more clearly through your essay. So once you have your draft thesis statement, go back and check it against these criteria. Does it answer the question? Does it look like the first one? Does it make a claim? Does it look like the second one? Does it include your main ideas? Does it look like the third one? And this is what I'm going to be looking for when you send your thesis statement to me. And these are going to be the 3 areas in which I might offer you suggestions or kind of paths to improvement. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, and it will almost certainly change by the time we get around to the final copy of your thesis, of your paper, sorry. But the stronger your thesis statement is, and the more thinking and planning you do before you get there, the easier the writing of the rest of your paper is going to be for you. All right, good luck. I look forward to seeing your work by Thursday morning.